In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to debug your web applications and how to monitor each web page and how it's performing internally by using the powerful functionality of Visual Web Developer 2005 Express Edition and ASP.NET 2.0. Now, one of the most challenging aspects of creating web-based applications versus writing Windows Forms applications, at least in the past, was the lack of tools to support debugging so that you could watch the code as it's executing that generates the dynamic web pages, to watch it and step through it line by line. And typically you'd have to resort to writing out trace values at the top or the bottom of your web page so you can get some feedback, so you can narrow down which line or which lines of code were causing problems within your web application. So that was hard enough during development of websites. But then that complexity was taken to a whole other level when deploying the web application. And I personally spent long hours trying to track down obscure bugs that only occurred in certain situations, only to find out that it only occurred on certain people's web browsers who had disabled this and enabled that and so on. Talk about a frustrating, meticulous line of work. So Visual Web Developer 2005 Express Edition makes it super easy to debug your applications during development time. In fact, it works almost identically to the debugging tools that you're already using when building Windows Forms applications in Visual Studio or Visual C# 2005 Express. You can set and manage breakpoints, you can view the values of variables and locals windows and watch windows, and a lot more. Also, ASP.NET 2.0 provides a tracing tool that makes monitoring how well your applications are functioning a snap. Super easy. And finally in this lesson, I'm going to show how to set a default error page that you can use to give the user a friendly notice that something bad just happened, instead of showing them an ugly error page that's generated automatically by the web server. You want to make it very friendly and show them a nice that you're in control at all times. And so we're going to demonstrate how to do that. It's very simple to do in ASP.NET 2.0. Okay, so in order to demonstrate the debugging features of Visual Web Developer 2005 Express Edition, I want to create a new website. Okay, and we're going to do something extremely simple. Just for the purpose of writing some code, I'm going to drag and drop, first of all, a label, a text box, and a button to my designer surface. Doesn't really matter how they're arranged. I am going to want to change the identifier here from button 1 to, well, button 1 is not so important. We want to change the text box 1 to first text box, and we'll change our label to something like result label. Okay, and then in the button 1 click event, we're going to write some code. Again, it doesn't really matter what this does. It's going to be super simple. String my string equals first text box dot text, and then we'll do result label dot text equals my string. Okay, very nonsensical, but here's what we're going to do with this example. We are going to stop the execution of the button 1 click event by setting a breakpoint in our left-hand column here. And the way that I do that on line 20 is that I can merely just click this little grayish area over to the left-hand side in order to set a breakpoint. I can also use the F9 key on my keyboard. In order to remove it, I just click it again and it's gone. I can also set a breakpoint and then right-click it and select Disable Breakpoint. Now this reminds me that I may at some point in the future want to stop the execution of my code right there, in which case I can just right-click and select Enable, or I can remove it again. So that's how you set a breakpoint. Now whenever we're running our application in debug mode, by clicking the little green arrow that says Start Debugging, we're going to begin running our website as we normally do. You can see our little website development server pop open. But this time, whenever we click the button control, notice that we're back into the Visual Web Developer interface, back to the code editor, And now you can see that line 20 is highlighted in yellow, and that there's a little yellow arrow that indicates what the next line of code to be executed will be. Now I have the full use of all Visual Studio style debugging tools at my disposal. For example, I have my little locals window down here at the bottom that I can see the current value of my local variables, including any objects that are referenced, including this object for the web page itself, the event args that are passed into this particular event handler, as well as the sender. I can also hover my mouse cursor over any of the objects that are referenced, in this case first text box, and I can look at the visualizer in order to see the value. So let me do that again here. Let me hover my mouse cursor over and then notice what was typed in to the text property, for example, by running my mouse cursor over it, as well as all the properties that are set, in this case to their default values available here. Okay, I can step into each line of code by using my little debugging toolbar over here. So I'm going to use the Step Into button on my toolbar in order to execute the line of code. Notice that whenever it executed that line of code, it assigned the value of my string to whatever nonsense that I typed in my keyboard. So you can see now my string, the value is red, which means that it just changed. Again, I can click my little visualizer here in order to see this in a window. If there was a lot of text, it would pop it open so I could see it all at one time. All right, and I can continue executing my application by hitting the Continue button or stepping to the next line. I can even set what the next statement will be that will be executed. I have my immediate window where I can change the value of my string if I wanted to on the fly. So I could do this, my string equals Bob. Okay, and I think that should change. See, my string is now Bob. So I have all of these little tools at my disposal here, and I'm going to continue running the application, and you can see now that because I changed the value of my string in the immediate window, I was able to then post the word Bob to a label. Okay, so how cool is it that you're able to work on a web page, develop it, and then debug it in a advanced set of tools that allow you full fidelity control over the debugging experience. Very neat. Okay, so the debugging tools are great whenever you're developing an application, but what if you've already deployed the application and you're finding that some users are having problems and you can't recreate those problems on your local desktop machine, but they're experiencing them whenever they use the public copy out on the internet or on the intranet or whatever the case might be. Well, fortunately, there are some tracing features that are available that allow you to see behind the scenes how each of your pages are executing. It allows you to monitor the values of the variables that are used within the web page. It allows you to even write statements out to this little trace utility for debugging purposes that nobody else sees. Okay, so let's show how to enable all of that. What I'm going to do is go to Website, and then at the very bottom, and this is the first time I've demonstrated this, is this ASP.NET configuration utility. I'm going to select it, and notice that our web server pops open, and I get this friendly website administration tool. And there's several things that I can do with this tool. I can set up security, including roles and users. I can configure the application, and we're going to use that in just a moment. I can also set up provider configuration information for accessing SQL files, Access files, XML files, and so on. Let's click on Application Configuration. Notice that we are now on the Application tab of our website administration tools, and I can see all the various things that I can set for my application. I can create application settings, so instead of hard-coding strings, I can save them in a friendly XML file and use this friendly little web interface to do that. I can set up my email settings so that my website can successfully email from the web pages. I can either start up or stop the application itself, and then I can also configure debugging and tracing information, which is what we're going to do right now. Now you can see here that we've already have enabled debugging set up for our application. We could remove this if we wanted to. However, what we're going to do is select the capture tracing information, which allows us to set some more properties for tracing. We can display tracing information on individual pages, which is how we're going to start. I'm going to accept all the rest of the default settings here, and we'll come back to this in just a moment. And I'm going to click the back button, and then I'm going to shut this down. I'm going to save what we have here, and then I'm going to run my application again. And when I do, notice this time what happens. Okay, now there's some little, because I've used relative positioning for my controls, we see a little bit of a run over here where my button is down into my tracing information. We can modify this so that the request details come below the entire web page. So I apologize for that, but you still get an idea of here of the tracing information that's enabled. I can see at each given step in the construction of our web page, the pre-init stage, the init stage, the init complete, preload, begin, end load, load complete, and so on, all the way through to the render stage. We can see the entire creation of our web page, how long it took to go through those given steps. I can also look at the various controls that are contained and the hierarchy of the containers that contain each control. We can look at session state information, application state information if we were to save values, as well as values that are in the cookies, in the response object, in the headers collection, the response, form, query string, server variables, just anything you possibly want to know about this web page and this specific request to this web page. Okay? How cool is that? Now, in most cases, you're not going to want to let everybody in the world see all that trace information. So how do I go about hiding it from everybody else, but create it in such a way that I can still look in and see what other people are experiencing on the website? So we're going to go back to our little configuration tool here. Go back to our Application Configuration tab. Select Configure Debugging and Tracing. And now let's look at this. We can display tracing information on individual pages and only display them for local requests. So in other words, if I set this to all requests, then everybody, whoever visits my website, will be able to see all that tracing information. By default, it was set to local requests, so only when I'm accessing the website from the same computer that it's hosted on will that tracing information be displayed. Okay, so that's one way to manage it. But there's also another way to do it as well, and that is to deselect this display tracing information on individual pages. Okay? And by doing so, now we have removed it. So let's go ahead and save this by hitting the back button, closing this down, and running the application again. And notice now that the tracing information is gone. So where can I then view all the trace information that's being collected for my web page? Well, it's through a special handler, a special page called trace.axd. And when I hit that page, notice that I'm able to now see a list of all of the pages that were recently viewed, whether it was from me viewing those pages or from any of the other users on the website that are looking at pages of off my web server. And I can see and set the number of requests that I should contain. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Notice that I only have 9 more remaining, so if I have a high traffic website, it might be easy to lose all this historical data. So we may need to set that number higher to maybe 25 or 50 requests. But now for all the individual requests, you can see there was a request for the default.aspx. I can click the View Details, and now I'm looking at all the trace information for that given request. And this will help me debug the application. Let me show you how. Not only does that tracing information show you the value of local variables, but what I can also do here is type in some additional code. For example, what I'll do here is trace.write. This is something I wrote. I could use this to provide feedback to me about how the application is executing, or whatever I come up with there. Now look what happens whenever I run the application again. I hit my web page. Now I go to the trace.axd page. Whoops. Let's just go to the trace.axd. Notice that now I have a second request at 10:07 a.m. I'm going to click the View Details. And now, between the page load and the end load, I see this little message that I wrote out using the trace object. This is something I wrote, blah, blah, blah. So I could write out any values just to make sure that it's getting to certain points within my code. And that has proved very helpful over the years to help me debug small problems that have occurred in specific situations. Okay, and again, I get all the rest of the information through here as well. Pretty cool. Now, if I go back to the ASP.NET configuration tool and go back to Application, look at Configure and Debugging Tracing, I can up that number of trace requests from the default value of 10 to something about 50, so I can view many different requests that are coming in instead of just 10 at a time. So if we have a higher volume website, we may need to do something like that. Okay, so that's great. Now let's move on to talk about one last topic before we conclude, and that is, what if problems occur on our website? Okay, let me show you what can happen if you're not careful. I'm going to comment out everything here by selecting it, clicking the comment button, and then I'm going to create some code that intentionally will break, just to show you how bad things can happen to good web pages. Okay, so we've created a user input integer. We're going to grab off the value, assuming that it's an integer. Okay, multiply it by 3, and then print it back out to the result label. So in a perfect situation, it would work like this. We'll put in the value of 5, click our button, and we get the value 15. But what if I type in the value of Bob and click the button? Then, let's do this. Let's stop this, and let us hit this page again. Unfortunately, this is going to be a little bit hard to reproduce. We're just going to open up a web browser, not be in debug mode, and type in the word Bob and click the button. And notice that this is the ugly web page that will appear to our end users unless we take some action to prevent that. We get an exception, input string was not in a correct format, and this isn't the kind of information I want my end users to look at. I would like for them to view a friendlier page. So what I'm going to do is create an error page by selecting Add Item, clicking just HTML page, and we'll just call this error.htm, and then we'll just type in something like, something very simple. We'll create a paragraph tag. Whoops, that wasn't exactly what I wanted. There we go. Sorry you saw this. We're experiencing problems. Please try again soon. And I can give it the look and the feel of, the rest of my website, so it doesn't have to be as bland as this particular page is, but you get the idea, okay? Now, in order for this little page to pop up whenever an exception occurs, I have to go to the ASP.NET configuration tool, select Application Configuration, Configure Debugging and Tracing, and then also, whoops, I'm sorry, let's go back one, I apologize. So we're on the Application tab of our Website Administration tool. I'm going to select Define Default Error Page. Okay, and this allows me to specify a URL to be used as the default error page. So I'm going to select error.htm, and I'm going to select the save, and then click OK. And now, in order to test that, what I'm going to do is just open up another web browser here and go back to the same page I was just at a moment ago. Let's see if I can get back to it here. Okay, great. So I'm going to type in Bob and then click the button. All right, now what you see here is the old error page. This is because I'm running this from the same machine where the website is hosted. However, other people will see this web page to HTML. Just trust me on this, okay? It's hard to demonstrate from one computer, but I hope you get the idea that you can set it up so that whenever a problem occurs, that they will see a nice friendly error page instead of the ugly ASP.NET 2.0 default. Okay, and before we close, I want to do one other thing, and that is solve the mystery of this neat little utility here, this ASP.NET configuration tool that we've been looking at. What happens is, whenever we make changes within this tool, those changes are saved to this mysterious web.config file that's been added to our websites whenever we were starting to debug the application. So I'm going to open up this web.config. And we already looked at this a little bit in the previous video. We haven't really talked about it that much, but in the previous video, recall that we added some providers for our own profile properties that we created. But there's also some other settings in here as well. Notice, for example, this custom errors entry into this XML file. Notice that we have this compilation debug equal true. So every time that it asks us, do you want to enable debugging, it's setting that property in the web.config. Also, notice here we have a tracing element that's been added to this XML file. Trace enabled equals true, request limit equals 50. And there will be some other properties set here as well, depending on the selections we make within this ASP.NET configuration tool. So there's nothing to be, amazed at, or there's nothing to be worried about if you make an incorrect selection. There's nothing magical going on. All the settings are actually made in this web.config file, which you can manually change if you want to. Okay? So we've talked about quite a few neat things in this lesson. First of all, we talked about the debugging tools that are available within Visual Web Developer. Notice how they're exactly the same as what we've been using in Visual C# 2005 or in Visual Studio in the past. We talked about how to use the tracing features in order to write out custom messages that are then viewable on either the web page, the same web page that we're currently looking at, or to a special handler called the trace.axd that allows us to review up to 50 different web requests, the last 50 web requests that have come in. We've taken a look at how to set a default error page for the entire website, and then also looked at where all these settings in that web application configuration tool are actually saved in the web.config file. So hopefully this was an eye-opener. You learned a lot from this lesson. If you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.